I wanted to ask you a question. I've seen a video of a brother Mohammed Hijab answering the question about Qada and Qadar, and he said that we can't fully understand it or explain it. We just have to accept the fact that that God is able to do, Allah is able to do so. But my question is, if we say, like, I have a dilemma, if we say that God is able to create like in a way that he's decided everything and it is our choice, and let's say in this scenario I end up a'udhu billah, in hell, can't God create also a scenario where I, in his will and my own will as well, take a choice to lead me to Jannah, where I end up in paradise? Because God is capable of everything. In this case, he is capable of making a scenario where in my free will I would end up in hell, and another one where in my free will I would end up in heaven. So how can I...
Yeah, the Quran says, وَلَوْ عَادُوا لَرُدُّوا لِبَانُهُ عَنْ. If they were returned, they would have gone back to doing what they used to do. This is a very important ayah. It's one of the most important ayat في باب القدر, one of the most in the ayah, in Surah Al-A'raf or Surah Al-An'am, one of them, verse 27, where it says, وَلَوْ عَادُوا لَرُدُّوا لِمَا نُهُوا عَنْ. If they went back, they would have gone back to doing what they were doing in the first place, meaning that the first test was fair.
Yeah, but I find it a little bit hard to understand.
No one understand. Look, let me tell you something. My brother. What's your name again? Hudi.
Abdurrahman. You can say
Abdurrahman. This issue of compatibilism, okay, let's just call it that for the sake of argument. How can determinism and free will exist at the same time?
Yeah.
There is no analogy. There is no human analogy that can describe how that can work. And I can tell you this from doing a lot of research on this matter. I was recently reading the Stoics. They have I'm not sure if you've heard of the Stoics, some philosophers, okay? And they were saying, look, it's like the very famous example actually of a cylinder and a cone. And they said, if you put a cylinder and a cone on the top of a hill, and you push the cylinder, and you push the cylinder is going to roll, the cone is going to stay still, yeah? That is because of an intrinsic property within the cylinder. In the case of the cylinder, it's roundability, as opposed to an intrinsic characteristic inside the cone. In this case, it's flat surface. If you push the flat surface of the cone, it's not moving, right? Even if you go to the top of the mountain, if you push the cylinder, it will roll because of something inside. And they were basically making the argument from compatibilism by saying this. They're saying everyone has some property within them. Okay, this is their argument. Everyone has a property within them that, yes, there is an antecedent set of events that come before, or causal uninterrupted chain. But when it pushes somebody, okay, there's two ways of reacting to it, and that depends on what kind of intrinsic nature you have. So they were making the argument that if, for example, life's events pushes you in a certain way, and if you're a ball, you're going to roll. If you're a cone, you're going to stay still on the top of the hill, right? And they were trying to make the argument that, look, this is exactly how they believed in determinism as well. They believed in Zeus, by the way, right, as you know. And they believed Zeus determined everything. So they said, okay, well, Zeus determined everything, but at the same time, there's human free will. And they define free will in this way, this intrinsic nature of human being, which can be moldable in certain ways. And then there's that push, right? And then the push goes there. And look, it might sound like a great analogy. Basically, he said, compare this, first of all, let me just tell you what the analogy is. Then he said, compare this with a man who's been pushed in a situation where he's now got, he sees money on the street. Yeah, he can either take the money and go, or he can try and find a person who the money belongs to. So in other words, they're pushed to the same event, but the money that they have a decision to make on how to deal with it, right? The truth of the matter is, this is an overly simplistic analogy, and it doesn't do a good job in explaining all the variables of. This is probably one of the best analogies that I've seen, but it doesn't do a good job of explaining everything. And there's no analogy, and I've seen a lot of them. Like, for example, even one analogy which made me think it was the right one for some time, that a man jumping into the swimming pool, but at the same time he's being pushed with the same force into the swimming pool. He couldn't have done otherwise, but he was going to do it anyway, right? But then I thought to myself, no, this was going for me for a long time, and then I thought critically about it. There's a problem with the analogy. The analogy is, no, on the determinist model, that even the man jumping himself, that's determined.
Exactly, because God created our thoughts, our wills, everything.
Thank you very much.
And a lot of these analogies also they presuppose something that's not in line with the divine nature.
Yes.
Meaning that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is as-samad, he is independent.
Yes.
And that is a problem. And that always
that's exactly right. Yes. Because if you go with that analogy that we were just talking about now, the guy doesn't jump in independently if we're thinking about it reasonably. Because in Islam, when we talk about independence, that's only to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, right? Because he's the only one who's the necessary existence. There's no one who's everything is hadith in that sense. Everything is caused. So then you have these tensions. The question is, how can it be possible to have a symbiotic? This is the question you're practically asking, which is the $1 million question, which has been asked for 2,500 years in philosophy.
I could even give you a thought experiment. Maybe it will explain more about how I think. We are either not free, or we are victims of our life. Because let's say that if I take you when you are a child and throw you in another circumstances, would you take the same choices? If yes, that would mean that you are not free, that you are pre-programmed to do that, because no matter what the input is, the output is the same. But if you don't, then
okay. Let me come to you, right? Let me take you out of your misery, with all due respect. You'll never, ever
please.
Let me tell you. You will never, ever find an analogy which correctly and holistically displays godly determinism and human free will. Those two things, in an analogy of human that we can conjure in our minds, you're not going to find it. You will not find an analogy that is going to, if you go back to the Stoics all the way to the modern day, there's not going to be an analogy that does this thing justice. Now, how do we explain the symbiosis, if you want to call it that, or the compatibilism? We believe in a compatibilism. There's two things that we can be sure of we can be sure of philosophically, or we can be sure of theologically. There are two things we can be sure of. I'm sure I have choice. Now, let me explain my key terms, okay? There's two ways of understanding this. You can understand this in the way that the classical compatibilists understood it, which is not the way we understood it, which is according to the principle of alternative possibilities, right? That it could have done otherwise. I could have done otherwise. Yeah? We don't believe we could have done otherwise. That's not correct. That's not what we believe. That is not choice. That's not my understanding of choice. I prefer irada, right? For me, is really a tarjih, which is it's an internal psychological thing which human beings come to by themselves, okay? And this is the definition of Ibn Taymiyyah and Al-Ghazali. So they say it's not something fil kharij. Anyways, it's not something which comes out in the kharij. That's the first thing. So, irada is tarjih, if you want to put it in one word, which means preference, number one, which is internal and psychological. Number two is this. I am sure I have preference. I am 100% sure I have preference as first person subjective, and I'm as sure as that as anything else. In fact, you are sure, because you wouldn't have this conversation with me if you didn't believe that. If we didn't believe we had preference, then these conversations are predicated on these things. Someone called Harry Frankfurt, he wrote a very interesting and important 17-page document, which I forget the name of, but it's a 17-page document where he talks about what he says there's three types of, and I like this, I've spoken to you about before. I like the way he breaks it down. And it's not in line with what we believe in. He says that there's something called first order desires, which is I like something. Second order desires, which is I am motivated to do something, or I want something. and second order volition, which means that I can attach values to something. I am sure I can do all three of those things, okay, according to the Frankfurt model. I am sure from a first-person subjective perspective, I can do all those things. I'm as sure as that and anything else. But I'm also sure that for all intents and purposes, there are a set of antecedent events that has happened in the past or a causal chain, and that Allah has determined everything. Now, these two things, right, seem contradictory, but I'm as sure of them and they're as demonstratable and true to me as anything else. Those two things, they are the basis for this conversation that we're having now, and any conversation that can ever be had at any time. They are the basis for that. So if we don't, these two things, if you don't affirm them, you're going to fall into absurdities. How they come together is a thing which I don't think mechanistically can be answered. And I'm being 100% honest. You can try your best. Frankfurt, it's called Frankfurt cases. These are one of the last attempts for compatibilists in the modern time. And there's been other thought experiments, but all of them are limited. Every single one of them are limited.
Yeah, exactly.
Yes, here's the truth of the matter. Those two things that we've just spoken about, are undeniable. I'll say one more thing. When I have preference, I do things. There's a question that one may ask in this at this juncture. They may ask the question: is my will that I have, does it have an effect on the world, an efficacious effect? Okay. Now, I believe yes, and this was the opinion of Ibn Taymiyyah, right? That it does have an efficacious effect. My will has an efficacious effect on the world around us. Now there's a question is what I'm doing, is it necessary or is it contingent? That's a very important question. Is what I'm doing, is it necessary or contingent? My actions are necessary, but they're not necessary in and of themselves. They are necessary because of Allah is the one who willed them. So it's called wajib li ghayrihi. So they're necessary because Allah, He willed it. He allowed it. He gave permission to the actions to take effect. But it's mumkin li nafsi. It's contingent in and of itself. So if you abstract my actions and if you abstract my behaviors and so on, they're possible in and of themselves, but they are wajib li ghayrihi. They're only wajib, or they are necessary because Allah has permitted them. How the two things are happening at the same time, there's so many theories. I'm not convinced of almost any of them. I am sure that the two things are happening at the same time, and they must be happening at the same time. I have complete taslim in this matter. I am completely submissive to this, not only just on theological grounds, but on philosophical grounds. That I have complete taslim, because it's almost qat'i from a philosophical perspective that our actions now, unless you believe in an occasionalism, which is actually a theologically okay concept, like rationally okay. But if you don't believe in an occasionalism, that it's true, all antecedent events cause what we're doing now. But I'm also sure I have preference. Now, how the two things are happening together and in that symbiosis, I have no answer for you in the how. And and by the way, Abdurrahman, one more thing.
Yeah.
This is not something new. Because we always say al-kayfiyatu majhul. Yani is not the will of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala a sifa of the sifat of Allah? Is it not an attribute of the attributes of God? The will. It's an attribute of the attributes of Allah, right? Just like all of the other attributes. We don't know the kayfiyah of any of the attributes of Allah. So what makes us think we know the kayfiyah of the will?
And I think it's important to understand, brother, that you could affirm the reality of two things that seem contradictory,
yes,
and have a form of skepticism, which is not a problem. So, for example, I know I have this kind of internal sensation of free will and preferences, and I know external to me, based on other evidences, that the Quran is true and the Prophet ﷺ is true, and they affirm the concept of divine decree and predestination. Those things in my mind, because I have epistemic limitations, I'm not going to know everything.
Yes.
I cannot reconcile them from the point of view that I could know their howness or their manifestation in a physicalist world. There's nothing wrong with that. So you could affirm that you have the internal reality of free will, this existential experience that you have free will. You could also affirm that you have preferences, and you could affirm in divine decree and predestination, and you can be skeptical about how you bring those two things together. And the question itself, and this is something very important when we talk about shubuhat, when we talk about doubts, the question itself is not what you call an undercutting defeat. It doesn't annihilate the foundations of Islam. It's one of those questions that you could discuss with maybe the Anbiya in Jannah when you get there. Inshallah, may Allah take you there, right? So I don't want you to, because sometimes we get consumed by a question and our whole world becomes that question.
It's true. Allah.
But what we need to do is take a step back and say, at the end of the day, I need to realize my epistemic limitations, even in consciousness, bro. Even in understanding consciousness in terms of its total reality, the inner subjective conscious experiences. Physicalism, for example, to try and reduce inner subjective conscious experiences to the physical reality of physical processes or even bits of matter, if you like, they have a big problem in trying to solve this problem. Now, that question itself, they're not throwing the physicalist project out of the window, for example, because they may have their own evidences why they should carry on this project. Now, you could infer from that there's nothing wrong with having an understanding of two different facts, but not knowing how to reconcile those two facts. And it's not.
Can I add to that? Just one more thing. No, I am claiming this today, and I mean this, right? This is something no one, on the question of mechanism, how, the how question.
Yeah.
I am saying this is something no one can be satisfied with, whatever school of thought you come from. And I'm not talking about Islam. I'm talking about whether you're a hard determinist, or if you're a compatibilist, or if you're a libertarian, you believe in libertarian free will, or if you are a Mu'tazili or an Ash'ari, or you believe in the Ibn Taymiyyah way in the Mas'ala of Qadr, or if you are an Arminian, right? You believe in Arminianism or Molinism or Calvinism or Reformed theology in Christianity, because all of those things are basically the same kind of things. Like, yani, everyone is yu'ani with this question. Every human being, whether they're Muslim or non, nobody has an answer that fills all the facts. If you're a determinist, you're not going to be able to explain the first person experience and how I have this preference making ability. You can't explain that. You can say, well, it's an illusion. But saying it's an illusion is a cop-out, with all due respect. That's not, for me, it's not a satisfactory answer. I'm seeing and feeling something immediately, and you telling me it's an illusion. So what you're saying must be an illusion as well. That's يعني من باب أولى.
Maybe that's why the hadith إذا ذكر القدر فانتهوا.
فأمسكوا. So basically the point is that what I'm saying is this mas'ala is forget about, let's pretend, yes, astaghfirullah, yani, but somebody, he becomes murtad because of this mas'ala. Yeah, he becomes kafir. Yeah, he says, I don't know how to explain it. Khalas, atruk ad-din. I'm not going to believe in Islam.
I have a question about that.
Now, let me just tell you something.
Okay.
Where are you going to go where this mas'ala is resolved?
Nowhere.
No, this is my question. And you go to Christianity, so you tell them, okay, I want to know, yani, what's your view on Qadr? They say, actually, we have 3 views, major views, for example, and there's more than 3, yeah? But we have the Calvinist idea, we have the Arminian idea, and we have, Molinism. You go to khalas, the Malahida, the Christians, you see, the atheists. You'll see that they're fighting. Daniel Dennett is fighting with Sam Harris, and one is compatibilist, and the other one is believes in determinism. This mas'ala is fawq istita'at al-aql. That's it. I'm convinced that this is something the human being cannot handle.
Absolutely.
I'm convinced by that. Yani, nowadays, and this is not something that's new, yani. Even if you look in science, you have this whole thing of underdetermination of the quantum world. You can get one particle that's in 2 places at the same time. This completely contradicts what we know of macro physics. Completely contradicts. But we're not going to deny it. We just don't understand it. As simple as that. Like, if there are things, there are mechanisms on the earth, physical mechanisms we don't understand. Ma baluk with the things that relate to the sifat of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala.
Absolutely.
But here's why I am absorbed of it. I'm sorry, it's very important. Sure. It's about, because I have read about kufr al-shak. It is about having misunderstand and have a thoughts or what can I say? You know what I mean, Muhammad.
Yes.
So exactly. I have doubts about this. Could that put me in a place where
I want to tell you, Abdurrahman, listen to me, yeah?
Yeah.
This mas'ala is unresolved in human history. Listen, Yani you can have shak wherever you are, whoever you are, wherever you are, you're going to have shak. If you look at this mas'ala just on merits of rationality, then there will be no one answer that helps you understand all the variables. That's
So
it.
it's okay to have shak in this.
No, it's not okay to have shak. Now what you have to clean. No, because yani, look, all I'm asking you to do, I'm not asking you to do something irrational. Wallahi, I'm not. All I'm asking you to do is affirm that which Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala affirms, number one, and that which is in line with your aql. It's the same thing. I've told you that philosophically, there is nothing anyone can do or say to dissuade me that I have what I call free will, which is the idea of preference, internal preference, whether it's actualized in the world or not. There's no argument that anyone can make that can dissuade me from that. But likewise, I can see the argument from antecedent events. If you don't believe in occasionalism or something like it, I get the argument. It's an extremely powerful argument. Both of those things are correct. Both of those things are demonstratable philosophically. The fact that we are, we have to affirm both. If they're both qat'i, what do you do when you have two things that are qat'i? You affirm the two qat'i things. And they're qat'i aqlan and naqlan. They're both in the naql is qat'i and the aql is qat'i. So you have to affirm. Now the kayfiyya, how do we know? I'll ask you now, how is it that in the quantum world that one particle can be in two places at the same time? How? I don't know. Do you know? How is it that when you do the double split experiment, that when there's an observation, it acts differently? All these things, Allahu Alam. You have to say Allahu Alam. So this is fawq istita'at al-aql. This mas'ala was put in human history by Allah to show human being his limitation. This
absolutely. So I was going to mention that. Don't forget, akhi, we have to see these issues from a holistic perspective as well. We need to understand that sometimes when you have the type of doubt that will border towards kufr, that is not necessarily because you haven't solved the question. It's because sometimes there is a subconscious spiritual reality that we think our aql is always going to answer everything, which has come from some kind of kibr. So it's very important that we understand this in that psychological, psycho-spiritual way, because these things are unresolvable from that perspective really just shows our limitations. And Allah knows and we don't. Allah has the picture, we just have the pixel. Allah is Al-Hakim, He is Al-Alim. He has the totality of knowledge and wisdom. And as Ibn Kathir said, that we have fragmentary pieces, if that. So from that perspective, this should create a sense of humility. And I want you to reflect on the narrative between Musa alayhi salam and Khidr. Beautiful, in chapter 18 of the Quran. Look at, now, obviously notwithstanding the difference of opinion about Khidr and his maqam, but generally speaking, look at the maqam of Musa alayhi salam, the status of Musa alayhi salam. But he goes to Khidr and he understands, as Ibn Kathir says, that Allah has given some wisdom to Khidr that he didn't give to Musa alayhi salam. And how is Musa alayhi salam's approach? It's relatively humble. Yes, and he tries to be patient, but sometimes he's not patient. But the whole point of the story from a psycho-spiritual perspective is this. Musa alayhi salam came across humble and he tried to be patient. And at the end, Khidr reveals the wisdom to him from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So from this perspective, it teaches us, if you are humble and you are patient, I am telling you, the answer is going to be revealed. And in this context, it could be there is nothing wrong with affirming two facts that are based on the aql, based on the intellect, and on the naql and on the text, and you not knowing how to reconcile them from a kind of howness perspective. And that's not an issue. So you can have a kind of skepticism concerning the how. That's not what's required of you. What's required of you is that you affirm what the aql and the naql say. Yes. You affirm what the intellect, obviously the sound intellect affirms, and what the kitab and the sunnah affirm. Now trying to reconcile how that happens, that is beyond us in my view.
And one more thing I want to add to it, is that for there's another important qaida or principle here, which is that anything which contradicts the intrinsic attributes of God, the sifat dhatiyah, those things that contradict those things are muhal aqlan. So for example, if someone asked a question, can Allah become a man? Which is the Christian dilemma, right? We say, la, he cannot become a man because this contradicts so many of his sifat salbiyah, for example, that he's pre-eternal, he's post-eternal, he's al-awwal, al-akhir, and all of these things. The fact that he's al-qawi, the fact that he is, so many things that it contradicts, right? So because it contradicts the intrinsic attributes of God, we say it's muhal. it's impossible, which means, it's impossible. Now, this mas'ala, it does not contradict Allah's attributes at all. Allah is saying, in fact, it has to be that way in order for all of Allah's attributes to be instated. Yani, Allah has to make the test fair so His justice can be instated. Because it would be unfair for Allah to create human being and burn them for no reason. Yani, like a puppet or something. No, it has to be based on our actions. So we are also acting freely and so on. But yes, Allah has willed, and He has willed with His knowledge. He has written it down, and He's done mashia, and He's done khalq of the af'al of the ibad. So how those two things come together, we don't know. But the fact that they come together does not do tanaqud or contradict any of the intrinsic attributes of God.
But you know what's interesting?
Therefore, it's not muhal.
Let me tell you something. I think, and this is me, I don't want to be controversial here today.
Yes, please.
But I think also, why have we assumed that this is a philosophical question? Like, let's be honest here.
Yeah.
Why have we assumed this is a philosophical question for us to even resolve?
Yeah.
Because when you see the instances on divine decree and predestination,
Yeah.
how are they revealed? How is Allah and His Messenger talking to us?
Yes.
They're doing it in a way to also liberate us from the shackles of us giving intrinsic power to the physical world.
Yeah.
Because what do we say in the Kitab and the Sunnah? La hawla wa la quwwata illa billah. There is no true power apart from the power of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala.
Yes.
And we know everything in the cosmos, everything in the universe happens because of the irada and the qudra of Allah, the will and the power of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala.
Right.
So internalize this existentially, what it means to exist with this idea internalized.
Yes.
It means that when you look at so-called enemies of Islam, when you look at the media, when you look at this, that, and the other, you don't give them any intrinsic power. You realize they are empty tools from a metaphysical point of view, that Allah has created them as empty tools and He's using them to manifest His irada and qudra. So what does this do to you? It means you don't really fear them intrinsically. It means that you don't think they're a real barrier, that this is just a way of Allah manifesting His irada and His qudra. So how is this liberating? Let me tell you why it's liberating. Because you won't fear them anymore and you go straight and think about Allah. And when you think about Allah's irada, His will, it's an unknown. You don't know what's going to happen in the next 5 minutes, 10 minutes, 15 minutes, or 20 minutes. This unknown is not disempowering, it's empowering. Why? Because it means you almost have a new realm of possibility to achieve what you can until the will of Allah has manifested itself.
Allah.
And when you've tried your best, and you've connected to Allah, then you know it's whatever has happened is good for you, because the believer knows that when Allah has decreed something for you, you can have not chosen anything better. If you really understand this idea, you realize how the Sahaba, it's the contemporary equivalent of a village on the Shetland Islands in Scotland, that they rise up with one man and one book, and after 13 years they take over the whole of Europe, spreading the peace and justice and mercy of Islam. They achieved that is because they truly internalized the true concept of Tawheed, or this aspect of Tawheed, that these things don't have any intrinsic power. That is how Qadr is supposed to liberate you, bro. But what we've been stuck in this kind of theophilosophical exercise, which is fine and important, of course, because we had our intellectual challenges throughout history. But at the end of the day, we have to internalize it from this point of view that literally will liberate us from the shackles of other things and so-called enemies and so-called obstacles. That's the understanding that we should have.
I like that. And I just want to add one more thing to it. I know we've kind of overcooked this a little bit, but Abdul Rahman, you know, on a practical level, it makes us be able to live, like have our cake and eat it both, right? There are advantages of knowing that we are not in control of things, and there are advantages of knowing that we are in control of things.
Yeah, if you are in control of everything, we have responsibility for everything. Exactly.
No, but it's like, if you know that there are certain things that are going to happen in your life that you are not in control over, that is a liberating feeling. That can put you in a state of tranquility and ease, because there's no regret from that perspective, or it couldn't have been otherwise. Feelings of deep regret will not factor into the equation. Allah, He only holds you to responsible for your spiritual actions. That's the only thing which really you need to look after, and that is your responsibility. So there are two things that having the belief of Qadr that we the Muslims, the Ahlul Sunnah, have, can give you. Number one is what the Prophet ﷺ said in the best hadith, for me it's my favorite hadith, which is Ajaban li amril mu'min. Wondrous is the affair of the believer. إِنَّ أَمْرَهُ كُلَّهُ لَهُ خَيْرٌ. All of his affair is good. وَلَيْسَ ذَاكَ لِأَحَدٍ إِلَّا لِلْمُؤْمِنِ. And this is not for anybody except for the mu'min. إِنْ أَصَابَتْهُ صَرَّاء شَكَرَ. If good things happen to him, he's thankful. وَإِنْ أَصَابَتْهُ ضَرَّاء صَبَرَ وَشَكَرَ. And if bad things happen to him, he is patient and he's thankful. Meaning what? Why did the Prophet said وَلَيْسَ ذَاكَ لِأَحَدٍ إِلَّا لِلْمُؤْمِنِ? He said it's not for anybody except for the believer, because this mas'ala of believing in qadr, that Allah is in control of everything, it puts you at ease that Allah is taking control of it. Even if something وَعَسَىٰ أَن تَكْرَهُ شَيْئًا وَهُوَ خَيْرٌ لَكُمْ, as the Quran says, and you can hate something, it's good for you.
Oh, never.
But that thing can be good for you, The thing you see as bad can be good for you. So you realize that as you're going through the thorny bushes of life, okay, and you get stung, that this couldn't have been any other way. You couldn't have avoided those thorny stinging branches. You couldn't have avoided them. But at the same time, one thing you have responsibility for, which is what you need to have, is your own actions. 1,000,000%, this is what Allah, He affirms. You have responsibility for your actions. He will give you permission. Allah will give you permission, okay, to act in the way you. And Ibn al-Qayyim al-Jawziyah in his kitab Shifa al-Alil, which if you are an Arabic reader, you should read this book. Shifa al-Alil, yeah?
Yeah.
He says in chapter 18, when he talks about the kasb of the Ash'a'ira, he says, وَنَحْنُ نَضْرِبُ فِي ذَلِكَ مَثَلًا شَرْعِيًّا. He says, and we will put or strike forward a parable, okay? And he says in this, and after he says, imagine a slave, Sayyid, okay, a Sayyid, and he has abd. He has abd, he's got a slave. A slave master has a slave. And هو يأذن له التصرف بالمال. يأذن له, he gives him permission to do تصرف بالمال, with money, okay? And then he says, وَلَهُ العقوبة, if he does bad, there'll be consequences and so on. So the slave goes out and he comes back, and depending on how he acts and how he spends the money, then he is either blameworthy or he is not blameworthy. Shahid, that Allah has given us permission, okay, to act in a certain way. He's given us permission. Obviously, we're not independently acting, because all of our qudra comes from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And this is the point of this analogy with Ibn al-Qayyim's. Even his mithal has this analogy with the waqi'. The point is with the reality. The point is we do have actions and we must act. وَقُولِ يَعْمَلُوا, and say act. Allah says that in the Quran. And so we, when it comes to our own spiritual decision makers, are the actors. But when it comes to things which are outside of our control, our scope of control, this is something we nufawwid al-amr ila Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. We completely leave this to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and this gives you the best peace of life. You cannot get tranquility from anything better than this.
So Abdurrahman, Habibi, we're going to get someone else on. Is that okay now?
Yeah. Thank you very much.
May Allah bless you. May Allah bless you.
جزاكم الله خيرا.
Exactly.